My sister didn't just destroy a car, she took the last piece of my father I could still touch. The 1967 Shelby Cobra 427 was more than polished chrome and roaring horsepower. It was weekends in the garage with him teaching me how to read the language of engines. It was the way his eyes lit up when sunlight hit that deep blue paint. 2 years after he passed, I stood in Aspen, listening to the MC's bright voice naming the finalists for Best Restored Classic, knowing the winner's circle would never be ours. In its place sat a charred skeleton on velvet, the air still carrying the ghost of smoke. The crowd saw a tragedy of machines. I saw the moment my own family turned me into the villain of his story. The air in Aspen that September felt thinner than I remembered, crisp and sharp against my skin, as I stood among the gleaming rows of polished chrome and deep lacquer. Engines purred in the distance, voices hummed around me, but all of it blurred into a low hum in my ears. The MC's voice cut through buoyant and bright, announcing the finalists for Best Restored Classic. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded in front of me, eyes fixed on the empty space where my father's pride and joy should have been. The spot was filled now with a charred skeleton of steel, the frame twisted, blackened, and set on a velvet-draped platform, like some grim exhibit. Visitors circled it with murmured curiosity. Some took photos. Most didn't know that 2 years ago that wreck had been a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427, the crown jewel of my father's collection, valued at $2.8 million. I could still hear my father's voice when he spoke about it. Not the numbers, but the way his eyes lit up when he ran a cloth over the curve of the fender. He used to say that car was proof that beauty and power could coexist, that craftsmanship mattered. When he died in 2021, he left it to me. Not to my older sister Sophia, who had worked alongside him in his Denver showroom for years, but to me, the one who moved to Chicago, built a career in finance, and stayed far away from the family business. I knew from the moment the lawyer read the will that Sophia wasn't happy. She smiled politely, but her knuckles whitened around the paper, and she didn't meet my eyes. I told myself it would blow over. That was naive. The MC called another name, and applause rippled through the crowd. I barely registered it. My gaze stayed on the Cobra's burned frame, my stomach tightening at the memory of what it looked like before the fire. The deep blue paint, the leather that smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar from my father's garage, the way the sunlight caught on the chrome trim. I had kept it exactly as he left it, stored in a climate-controlled garage in Colorado Springs, checking on it whenever my work allowed. I thought I was protecting his legacy. Instead, I was watching it rot in front of me, every flake of char, a reminder of how easily trust can burn. Someone brushed past me, their perfume sharp and floral. I stepped aside, catching snippets of their conversation. They were debating whether the fire had been accidental. I could have told them it wasn't. That a few months ago, Sophia had walked into my life with a look I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. That my mother had looked me in the eye and told me I should share the value of the Cobra with my sister because it was only fair. That when I refused, the air in the family turned cold. I didn't tell the strangers any of that. I just kept standing there, my reflection fractured in the chrome hubcap that had somehow survived the fire. My breath fogged in the cool air, and for a moment I felt like I was back in the garage, the scent of gasoline and old leather thick around me. But then the memories shifted, replaced by smoke sirens and the sight of flames curling over the hood. The MC's voice faded again. I remembered the call that woke me early that May morning, the panic in Derek Lawson's voice. The way my hands shook as I grabbed my keys. The drive to Colorado Springs felt endless, the mountains blurring past as dread settled in my chest. By the time I arrived, the firefighters were rolling up their hoses. Derek was waiting by the curb, his expression grim. I didn't cry then. I just walked into the garage, or what was left of it, and looked at the Cobra. The heat had warped the metal, peeling the paint into curling black strips. The steering wheel was nothing but a brittle ring. I reached out, but the heat still radiated, forcing me to pull back. Sophia arrived 20 minutes later. She moved through the wreckage like a tourist, her heels clicking on the concrete, her voice soft with something that was almost pity. She put a hand on my shoulder and whispered so low only I could hear. "Too bad, Liv. But nothing lasts forever." The thing about Sophia is, she never says anything she doesn't mean to cut. I had learned to live with her barbs to pretend they didn't sink deep. But standing in that garage smelling the acrid stench of burnt rubber and chemicals, I felt something settle in me. I looked away from the charred frame in Aspen, the applause around me already moving on to another award. My jaw tightened. I knew exactly when this story had shifted from inheritance to war, and it hadn't started with the fire. It had started long before in a lawyer's office 2 years earlier, with the sound of paper sliding across a desk, and the weight of my father's last wish landing squarely in my lap. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee, the kind of scent that seeps into wood paneling and never leaves. I sat at the long table, my palms pressed flat against the smooth surface, listening to the shuffle of papers. The lawyer, a tall man with graying hair and the kind of voice that could read the weather report and make it sound final, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. My mother, Margaret, sat to my left, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back perfectly straight. Sophia was across from me, leaning back in her chair, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, in a pose that spoke more of ownership than grief. He began reading my father's will in that steady tone, the one that stripped every word of emotion. Most of it was straightforward property in Denver, to my mother investment accounts split evenly, small bequests to old friends. I kept my gaze low, tracing the grain of the table until I heard the words about the Shelby Cobra. He stated plainly that my father wished the car to remain in my care, that it should be preserved and eventually donated to the Colorado Springs Automotive Heritage Museum. I looked up, unsure I had heard right. Sophia's lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She reached for the copy of the will the lawyer had just slid across to her, scanning the paragraph slowly. Her fingers tightened around the paper until her knuckles whitened. My mother's expression barely shifted, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, a glance toward Sophia, that said she understood the slight. When the meeting adjourned, I rose, clutching my own copy. Sophia stood at the same time, moving toward me with that feline grace she has always had. She stopped close enough that I could smell her perfume, expensive and sharp, and murmured that it would be interesting to see how long I could keep it. Then she stepped away, her heels clicking on the tile, her voice lifting brightly as she thanked the lawyer for his time. That night I couldn't stop replaying the moment. It wasn't just about the car. My father choosing me for this, the one thing Sophia had worked with him on for years, was a shift in the family's balance that I knew she wouldn't let slide. I thought about the garage in Colorado Springs, where the Cobra sat under its custom cover, the polished chrome the engine he had rebuilt with his own hands. I wondered if he had known what giving it to me would mean. I flew back to Chicago 2 days later, the city skyline rising against a winter sky as the plane descended. Work at North Point Capital consumed my day's meetings, stacked on meetings, market reports, late-night calls with West Coast clients. But in the quiet moments, Sophia's voice crept back in. My phone lit up occasionally with her name, short messages about family dinners. I had missed the occasional photo of the showroom she ran in Denver, with some rare classic on display. I always replied politely, never more than a few words. In early spring of the following year, my mother called. She said she was thinking of hosting Easter at her house, and that it would be good for the family to see each other. Her tone carried that unspoken insistence she had always used to corral us into the same room. I agreed, thinking maybe time had dulled the edge. When I walked into her kitchen that afternoon, the smell of roast lamb and fresh bread filled the air. Sophia was already there, leaning against the counter in a silk blouse the color of champagne, chatting easily with 2 of our cousins. She looked up at me with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. We went through the motions, plates passed, polite conversation. But later, when the cousins had stepped outside, my mother leaned toward me and said she still thought it would be fair to share the value of the Cobra with my sister. I set my fork down slowly, meeting her gaze. I reminded her that it wasn't a matter of fairness. It was my father's wish written into a legal document. She sighed, her eyes softening in that way that made me feel like a stubborn child, and said that sometimes family meant bending the rules. Across the table, Sophia watched us quietly, her lips curving just enough to let me know she had heard every word. That evening, as I drove back to my hotel, the streets lit by the warm glow of street lamps. I thought about how small the city felt compared to Chicago, and how small my place in this family had always been. I told myself again that I could handle it, that as long as the car was safe, I could weather whatever cold shoulders or whispers came my way. I was wrong. In April of 2023, I made the drive from Denver down to Colorado Springs, with the windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of pine. The mountains were still dusted with snow, bright under the midday sun, but the air carried that first hint of spring. I had cleared my schedule at North Point for a long weekend, telling myself it was just to check on the Cobra to make sure everything was exactly as it should be. Derek Lawson was already waiting when I pulled up to the garage. He leaned against the hood of his pickup, hands in the pockets of a worn leather jacket, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. Derek had been my father's friend since before I was born, a man who knew every sound an engine could make and every shortcut in the county. He greeted me with a nod, no small talk, just a tilt of his head toward the side door of the garage. Inside, the familiar scent of motor oil and aged leather wrapped around me like a memory. The Cobra sat in its usual spot, draped in the custom cover my father had ordered from Italy. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Then Derek crouched by the side entrance and pointed to the frame. There were scratches around the lock, fresh ones, the paint on the metal edge chipped. Near the threshold, faint streaks of dirt cut across the smooth concrete floor, not the fine dust that drifted in naturally, but gritty clumps, like someone had stepped in from a trail. I knelt beside him, running my fingers over the marks. "When was the last time you were here?" he asked without looking at me. 6 weeks ago, I said. The garage alarm hadn't gone off, and the locks were the same as always. He straightened slowly, eyes scanning the room like he was taking a mental photograph. Could be nothing he said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that. Later that afternoon, I met Paige Carter for coffee at a small place downtown. Paige had been my closest friend since college, the kind of person who always seemed to have her camera slung over one shoulder. She set her cappuccino down and pulled out her phone, swiping until she found the photo she wanted. She turned the screen toward me. It was Sophia. She was standing in the gravel lot just outside the garage fence, dressed in a dark coat, her hair pulled back. The light suggested early evening, the kind of dusky blue that slips in before the street lamps come on. Paige explained she had been shooting a sunset sequence from across the street 2 nights earlier when she noticed her and took the shot. I stared at the image, my thumb hovering over the glass. "Did you talk to her?" I asked. Paige shook her head. She left after a few minutes, didn't see her go inside. Still, the sight of her there tightened something in my chest. The next day, I drove up to Denver under the pretense of visiting my mother. I found Sophia at the showroom arranging a display of vintage steering wheels. She looked up, a slow smile forming. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" she said. I told her I had been at the garage. I told her about the scratches on the lock, the dirt on the floor. She lifted one eyebrow, an expression of feigned curiosity. "Maybe you should get better locks," she said. When I mentioned seeing the photo, her smile widened. "Oh, that. I was in the area. That garage isn't exactly Fort Knox, Olivia. Anyone could walk in." She turned back to the display, her hands moving with practiced ease. The dismissal was as deliberate as the words. I stood there for another moment, watching the light from the front windows catch on the polished chrome behind her, then walked out. That evening, I returned to the garage one last time before heading back to Chicago. I checked every window, every lock, the alarm panel. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I pulled the door shut behind me and heard the solid click of the electronic lock engaging. I took 3 steps toward my car before the sound came again, a second click, sharper this time from inside the garage. I froze, the hair on my arms rising. The lot was empty, the fence line still. I scanned the shadows, listening, but there was nothing more. Only the faint hum of the street lamp overhead and the low rustle of wind across the gravel. 2 weeks later, my mother called and invited me to dinner at her house in Denver. Her voice carried that tone I had known all my life, the one that made it clear attendance was not optional. I drove up on a Thursday evening, the sky streaked in pink and gold as the sun dipped behind the mountains. My mother's neighborhood was quiet. the kind of place where lawns stayed trimmed and porches looked staged for a magazine shoot. Inside the dining room table was already set candles, lit a roast in the center, filling the air with the smell of garlic and rosemary. My cousins Mark and Helen were there, glasses of wine in hand, chatting with Sophia near the sideboard. She looked perfectly composed in a cream sweater and gold earrings, as if the world was exactly the way she wanted it. We sat down, plates passed around, small talk floating between bites. My mother waited until the second course to say what she had clearly been holding. Olivia, I have been thinking. I think it would be right if you shared the value of the Shelby with your sister. The words landed heavier than the cut crystal in her hand. I set down my fork and asked her why she would say that when she knew exactly what was in the will. She gave a small shrug, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to soften the blow. Because it is only fair. You know how much time Sophia spent with your father on that car. It was part of the business part of the family. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on mine. I do not even want to take it from you, Liv. I just do not want to see it sit there until you decide to sell it for a payday. My jaw tightened. That is not what this is, and you know it. Mark, who had been swirling the wine in his glass like he was on a tasting panel, spoke up. You holding on to that car like it is some personal trophy is not helping anyone. It makes the rest of us feel like you are looking down on the family. The room felt smaller. The air between us thickened with the weight of too many years of unspoken things. I glanced at Helen, hoping for some sign of neutrality, but she avoided my eyes and reached for the bread. My mother's gaze stayed on me, calm but unyielding, like a judge who had already decided the verdict. I told them again the will was clear. My father's instructions were specific. This was not a negotiation. Sophia gave a soft laugh, one that carried no humor. Sure, Olivia. Keep pretending it is about honoring Dad. I felt heat rise in my chest, not just from the words, but from the way the others shifted subtly toward her side, their silence a kind of endorsement. The rest of the meal dragged on, the clink of cutlery, and occasional forced laugh filling the space where conversation should have been. By dessert, the tension was impossible to ignore. Helen excused herself early, saying she had an early morning. Mark followed, muttering something about traffic. When the front door shut behind them, the quiet in the house was sharper. My mother began clearing plates, and Sophia lingered, swirling the last sip of wine in her glass. I helped stack the dishes in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of my hands moving over porcelain and silverware, a small comfort. My mother said nothing more about the car, but she did not need to. I had heard enough. As I stepped out into the cool night, I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical. This was no longer about a difference of opinion. I was no longer just the daughter who moved away, the sister who did not take over the showroom. I was the outsider holding something they believed belonged to them. And that made me the target. The call came just after sunrise on May 15th. My phone rattled against the nightstand, pulling me from a shallow sleep. Derek's voice was tight. The words clipped as if speaking them too slowly might make them real. There has been a fire at the garage. You need to get here now. I was on the road within 10 minutes, hair still damp from the cold shower I took to jolt myself awake. The mountains blurred past in streaks of gray and green, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they ached. Every mile felt heavier than the last. I kept telling myself maybe it was small, maybe the alarm had done its job. But when I turned down the familiar road and saw the fire trucks and the haze of smoke still drifting into the morning air, the hope in me collapsed. The side door hung open, the frame blackened. The concrete outside was wet, reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky. I could hear the last hiss of water on metal. The smell hit me before I stepped inside a harsh mix of scorched rubber, melted plastic, and something chemical that made the back of my throat sting. The Cobra was gone. Not stolen, not moved, but destroyed. The once perfect curves were warped and black, the chrome dulled to a ghost of its shine. The leather seats were nothing but brittle shapes. I moved closer without realizing it, my fingers hovering over the edge of the fender before the residual heat forced me to pull back. Derek came up beside me, his jaw tight. Fire department says electrical fuse box failure. He shook his head once slow. But I smell something off. Accelerant, maybe. I swallowed hard, my eyes tracing the floor where dark streaks and puddles marked the path of the hoses. A firefighter passed us carrying a clipboard. He nodded at me politely but didn't stop. I caught the words preliminary report and possible investigation. They sounded far away, like I was hearing them through glass. I turned at the sound of heels on concrete. Sophia was there, perfectly dressed in a navy blazer and dark jeans, her hair pulled into a sleek knot. She stepped over a charred piece of debris, as if it were nothing, her expression carefully arranged. She came close enough that her perfume cut through the stench of the fire. Her hand landed on my shoulder, a gentle weight that made my skin prickle. "Such a shame, Liv," she said softly, almost tenderly. "But you know nothing lasts forever." The words slid under my skin like a cold blade. I searched her face for any crack, any sign of real grief or shock, but there was only that faint, knowing smile. My chest felt tight, my pulse loud in my ears. I pulled away from her hand and stepped back, trying to draw air into my lungs despite the lingering smoke. Derek was watching her, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing. Sophia lingered a moment longer, then glanced around the garage as if appraising the damage for herself. She walked toward the door without another word, pausing only to adjust the cuff of her sleeve, before disappearing into the daylight. I stood there long after she left the charred frame of the Cobra in front of me, the acrid air burning my eyes. Somewhere behind me, a fire investigator asked Derek a question about the wiring. I could not bring myself to turn away. Derek caught up with me outside the cold air, a sharp contrast to the heavy heat that still clung to my clothes. He didn't say anything at first, just reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a clear evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled plastic fuel container, the label half burned away. "Found it in the dumpster behind the service alley," he said quietly. "Still had residue inside. Does not belong here." My stomach sank. "You think someone used it to start the fire?" Derek's expression was flat. "I think someone wanted that car gone." By late afternoon, I was in Ethan Miller's office downtown. He was one of the few attorneys I trusted, sharp-eyed and relentless when it came to evidence. His assistant, Emily Parker, listened as I laid out what Derek had found and the uneasy details that had been building for months. She took quick notes, her pen tapping lightly against the pad. "If there are security cameras in the area, we can get a subpoena for the footage. Time is critical," she said. I gave her the location of the garage and the nearby businesses. She promised to draft the paperwork immediately. Ethan leaned back in his chair, hands steepled. "If Sophia is involved, you need more than suspicion. You need proof that will stand in court." 2 days later, Emily called me at work in Chicago. "I've got something, but you need to see it for yourself." I caught the evening flight to Denver, the unease in my gut growing with every passing hour. Paige met me at a small coffee shop near the courthouse. She slid into the booth across from me, her camera bag beside her. "I was shooting some architectural details downtown a couple days before the fire," she said, and I walked past the street behind the garage. It was getting dark, but the lot was lit enough for a long shot. She opened her laptop and pulled up a grainy, still image. The figure in the photo was tall shoulders squared under a dark jacket. Even in the low resolution, the way she carried herself was unmistakable. Sophia was standing near the side entrance, her head tilted toward the lock. A large duffel hung from one shoulder, the kind you could fit tools or, God help me, a container of fuel inside. I stared at the screen. The timestamp on the corner read May 13th, 7:42 p.m., 2 days before the fire. Emily arrived minutes later, breathless from the cold, and set a folder on the table. "Metadata from the original file confirms the time and location," she said, "and we cross-referenced it with city traffic cameras. She was parked a block away in her Range Rover at 7:35. The noise of the coffee shop faded. I saw again the way Sophia had walked into the garage the day of the fire, her heels clicking on the concrete, her voice low in my ear. I heard Derek's voice, certain and steady, saying someone wanted that car gone. "What now?" I asked. Emily glanced at Ethan's number scrawled on a notepad. "He is already drafting a formal request to preserve every frame of footage from the surrounding area." We will add the fuel container to the chain of evidence, but we need to be careful. If she suspects we are closing in, she could make this a lot messier. I closed the laptop gently, my fingers lingering on the cool metal. Messy was already here. 2 nights later, I found myself sitting at my mother's dining table again. But this time, there was no roast, no small talk. Margaret sat at the head of the table with a notepad in front of her. Mark and Helen were there too, flanking her like a board of directors ready to vote. Sophia sat at the far end, one elbow propped on the armrest, her fingers slowly twisting the gold ring on her right hand. "We need to discuss the situation," my mother began, her voice calm but deliberate. "The loss of the Shelby is not just your loss, Olivia. It was a part of the family's legacy." I reminded her evenly that the will stated the car was entrusted to me for preservation and eventual donation. It was not co-owned. It was not communal property. Mark leaned forward, his voice already raised. "Legal documents aside, you had a responsibility to protect it, and you failed." Helen chimed in without looking at me. "If you had kept it somewhere more secure, we wouldn't be here." I felt my pulse rising but kept my voice steady. The garage was secure, the alarm was working. What happened was not neglect. Sophia spoke for the first time, her tone soft, but dripping with implication. Maybe it was not neglect, but it was predictable. Things of that value attract trouble. Margaret folded her hands. "The point is, the damage is done. The insurance payout will not come close to the car's true value. We believe you should cover the rest." The words hung in the air like smoke. Cover the rest meant paying out of my own pocket nearly $2.8 million. I let the silence stretch, looking from one face to another. The expectation in the room was suffocating. "I am not paying for something I did not cause," I said, finally. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then, I am afraid this may have to be resolved through other means." The meeting broke after that, no one offering a handshake or even a goodbye. I walked out into this cold night, the sound of Sophia's ring tapping against the armrest still echoing in my ears. The next morning, a courier knocked at my apartment door in Chicago. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a letter from a Denver law firm I recognized as the one Sophia used for her business contracts. The letter demanded full compensation for the appraised value of the Shelby Cobra, citing negligence in safeguarding a family asset. Attached was a draft of a civil complaint ready to be filed in county court. I read it twice, my hands tightening around the pages. They were moving quickly, and they were not bluffing. By the end of the week, the calls started. Friends from the Colorado Springs Automotive Club left voicemails with a cautious tone. Some asked if the rumors were true, that I had let the Cobra's maintenance lapse, that I had refused better security. At a Saturday brunch in Chicago, a fellow collector approached me with raised brows and said he had heard the story making rounds online. In the closed circles of collectors and restorers, reputation was as valuable as the cars themselves. Once it frayed, it was almost impossible to stitch back together. That night, I sat in my apartment, the Denver skyline, printed on the back of the legal letter, like a stamp of inevitability. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. The thought came quietly, but with weight. They were not just trying to take money. They were trying to erase me from my father's legacy entirely. 2 days later, an email landed in my inbox with no subject line and an address I didn't recognize. There was only one sentence in the body and an audio file attached. "Thought you should hear this." I sat back in my chair, the cursor hovering over the file, my pulse picking up. When I clicked play, the sound was muffled at first, the background a low hum of what could have been an office or a workshop. Then Sophia's voice came through clear enough to cut through any doubt. "If I wreck it, she will have to split the money with me anyway." The words made my stomach tighten. I played it again and again, listening for any sign it was edited, for any inflection that might suggest a joke. There was none. It was flat, calculated, and real. I forwarded the file to Ethan without comment. He called me within the hour. "Where did you get this?" he asked. I told him about the anonymous sender. "Could be someone from her showroom," he said. "We will need to verify the source and chain of custody, but if it checks out, this is damning." Later that afternoon, Ethan looped in Emily and their audio forensic contact. By evening, he called back to tell me the file was authentic. No manipulation, no splicing. The metadata matched the date 3 weeks before the fire. While that was moving forward, the lab results on Derek's fuel container came in. Ethan slid the report across the table to me in his office. The accelerant compound found on the plastic matched the residue in the burn patterns on the garage floor. It was a petroleum-based blend not sold commercially in Colorado, meaning it was brought in deliberately. The kicker was the second page. No trace of that compound was found in the garage before the fire, according to environmental swabs taken during a previous inspection for the museum grant. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing down. Sophia had been at the garage 2 days before the fire. She had been photographed carrying a bag large enough to hide that container. Now, there was her voice captured without her knowledge, all but confessing intent. Ethan's gaze was steady. This is the kind of evidence that can turn a civil case into a criminal one. Are you ready for that? I thought of my father's hands on the Cobra's steering wheel, the way he spoke about the car, as if it were a living piece of history. I thought of Sophia's smile in the smoke-filled garage, the squeeze of her fingers on my shoulder. Yes, I said. I am ready. That night in my apartment, I laid out everything on the dining table. Photos, transcripts, reports, the letter from her lawyer, and now the audio file. I began drawing lines between them, dates in one column, actions in another. The picture that formed was no longer a cloud of suspicions, but a chain of events, each link pulling toward the next. It was no longer enough to defend myself. It was time to go on the offense. Ethan filed our complaint with the county court on a Monday morning, the kind of cold, bright day when the mountains looked close enough to touch. He cited the no contest clause in my father's will, making it clear that if Sophia's actions were proven to challenge the distribution in bad faith, she could forfeit her share of the estate entirely. 2 days later, her lawyers answered with a counterclaim accusing me of fabricating evidence, staging a false narrative to hold on to the car and collect the insurance payout. The language was sharp, accusing, written to wound as much as to persuade. The first deposition took place in a narrow conference room with too much glass and not enough air. Sophia sat across from me in a charcoal suit, her hair perfectly pinned, eyes bright and cold. Her attorney did most of the talking, but when the questions landed directly on her, she leaned back, offering answers that were technically responses, but never quite touched the heart of what was asked. Did you enter the garage on May 13th? I was in the area. Did you carry a duffel bag? I carry many things for work. Do you know what an accelerant compound is? I am not a chemist. Derek was next, his broad frame filling the chair, his voice steady as he described finding the burned container in the dumpster. Paige followed, recounting how she had taken the photograph and preserved the file. Emily testified to the chain of custody from the subpoenaed footage, detailing the timestamp matches without hesitation. Each session left me drained, the careful pacing of questions and objections stretching hours into days. By the end of the week, I could recite every procedural phrase in my sleep. Then on a Friday afternoon, Janet Holmes called. She was a local reporter with a reputation for digging into stories that others skirted. I heard you have quite a battle brewing in probate court, she said. She had seen the filings and wanted to know if I was willing to go on record. I hesitated, but something in her tone told me the story was going to run, whether I spoke to her or not. We met the next morning at a diner on the edge of town. Janet was direct, her recorder placed openly on the table. She asked about the Cobra, the will, and the weeks leading up to the fire. I stayed within the bounds of what Ethan had cleared, but I made sure the truth of my position was clear. The article went online that evening, the headline pulling no punches. Legal war over $2.8 million classic car engulfs local collector community. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers who followed the vintage car world. Some offered support, others wanted the inside scoop. By Sunday, the club's forum was alive with threads debating the case, posting old photos of the Cobra at shows, speculating about motives. Every move felt amplified now, every word weighed for how it might play both in court and in the court of public opinion. The board was set, and every piece was in motion. The final hearing fell on the last Thursday of August. The air outside the courthouse was hot enough to shimmer the kind of late summer heat that clung to your skin. Inside the courtroom was cool and still, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound before the judge took the bench. Ethan sat beside me, his notes arranged in a neat stack. Across the aisle, Sophia was flanked by her attorneys, her hair perfectly in place, her eyes forward. She didn't look at me, not once. The proceedings moved quickly. Both sides had presented every piece of evidence over the past weeks, and today was about final arguments. Ethan spoke with precision, laying out the chain of events and the evidence that tied them together. He reminded the court of the no contest clause in my father's will and what it meant when a beneficiary acted in bad faith. Sophia's counsel painted me as vindictive, obsessed with holding onto the car for personal gain, accusing me of manipulating witnesses. It was nothing I hadn't heard before, but in the quiet of the courtroom, the words felt sharper. When the judge began reading the decision, my hands tightened in my lap. The ruling was clear. The court found that Sophia's actions constituted a direct challenge to the will's terms, triggering the no contest clause. She was removed from any inheritance under the estate and ordered to pay all legal costs associated with the case. For a moment, I couldn't move. The words settled over me like a heavy blanket, part relief, part exhaustion. I had won, but the victory was edged with a kind of sadness I hadn't expected. This was my sister, and whatever we had left of a relationship was now gone. Sophia stood slowly, her face pale. She said nothing, just gathered her bag and followed her attorneys out. In the gallery, I noticed several members of the Colorado Springs Automotive Club exchange looks before turning away from her. A few didn't bother hiding their disappointment as they walked out without a word in her direction. I stepped into the hallway, the bright afternoon light streaming through the high windows. Thomas Reed, one of the club's senior members, approached me with an open hand. "We would be honored to have you at the Aspen Classic in September," he said. "Sophia was going to take the showcase slot, but given the circumstances, we would like you there instead." I shook his hand, the formality of it almost surreal after everything that had happened. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, despite the swirl of emotions inside me. Outside, the air hit me like a wave. People were already dispersing, the courthouse steps half empty. I stood there for a moment, letting the sun warm my face, trying to absorb the fact that it was over. The fight that had consumed months of my life had reached its end, but the echoes of it would follow me for a long time. I left the courthouse with no intention of looking back. The thought of rebuilding the Shelby had crossed my mind more than once, but now the idea felt wrong. Some things were meant to stay as they were, even if that meant they remained broken. 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of papers and a blank checkbook. The decision had settled in quietly, but firmly. Instead of restoring the car, I would put its insurance payout to work in a way my father would have approved of. The Richard Grant Fellowship would fund $250,000 each year for the next decade, awarded to young women pursuing automotive engineering at the University of Denver. My father had always believed in opening doors for those who were overlooked, and I could think of no better tribute. Ethan reviewed the documents, nodding as he scanned the terms. "This will outlast all of us," he said. That was the point. By the time the Aspen Classic rolled around in September, word of the fellowship had already spread. The exhibition hall was alive with the scent of polished chrome and leather voices echoing under high timber beams. Thomas Reed met me at the entrance, guiding me toward the main stage where the announcement would be made. When I stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted. I spoke about my father, about the lessons he had passed down, not just in mechanics, but in integrity. I told them about the fellowship, about the young women who would have the chance to study and work in a field that still rarely welcomed them. The applause was warm and sustained. I stepped back, letting the moment belong to the people who would benefit from it. As I moved toward the display area, I saw the Cobra's charred frame positioned under a single spotlight. The warped metal gleamed faintly, the scars telling their own story. A small plaque read, "Preserved in honor of Richard Grant, a testament to endurance and justice." In the middle of the reception, I noticed a quiet commotion near the entrance. A group of automotive club members had gathered, their voices low but firm. Moments later, Thomas leaned in and told me they had voted to expel Sophia from the club. The decision was final and immediate. I did not seek her out, though I caught a glimpse of her near the exit. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable as she stepped into the sunlight and disappeared from view. I stayed by the Cobra for the rest of the afternoon, speaking with visitors, answering questions about the car's history, and watching as people paused to read the plaque. It was no longer just my father's car. It had become something larger, a symbol that even in loss, there could be meaning worth preserving. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains when the crowd at the Aspen Fairgrounds began to thin. I walked toward the parking lot, the cool bite of autumn air wrapping around me, carrying with it the faint smell of pine. My steps slowed when I saw her leaning against a dark sedan parked near the edge of the lot. Sophia was dressed in a simple gray coat, her hair pulled back, no trace of the polished armor she had worn in court. She didn't speak when I approached. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were soft, the colors faded, but still clear enough to see the three of us standing in front of the Shelby Cobra. My father had one arm around each of us, smiling, the car's paint gleaming like liquid midnight. I remembered the day, the smell of engine oil and fresh wax, the way Sophia had leaned into him. Her eyes met mine for a moment, steady, but without apology. I took the photo, feeling the texture of the paper against my fingertips. I nodded once in acknowledgement, but not an invitation, then slipped it into my coat pocket. There were no words left that would change anything. She straightened her hands back in her coat pockets and stepped away toward her car. The sound of the door closing echoed briefly in the quiet lot. I watched the taillights fade into the dark, the silence settling in around me. Driving back to the hotel, the photograph rested on the seat beside me. I thought about my father, about the way he believed that character was proven not in what you won, but in what you chose to protect. Somewhere along the way, I had learned that victory was not making someone else fall. It was in holding your ground, in turning loss into something that could outlast the pain. When I reached my room, I set the photo on the desk next to the event program and the small plaque the club had given me. Outside, the night deepened over Aspen, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Sometimes the real boundary is not the one you draw to keep others out, but the one you hold to keep yourself whole. And when someone tries to make you pay for their mistakes, the most powerful choice you can make is the one that forces them to face the truth and themselves. If you have ever stood in that place where walking away feels harder than fighting, I want to hear your story. Share it. Let others know what it means to protect your own ground. And remember, every ending you survive can be the start of something worth keeping.